So now we optimized our code, maybe with React Memo, but especially as shown in the last lecture with lazy loading. Now we can build our app for production. And with that, I mean that we can run a script which will take all our code, convert it to JavaScript code that the browser understands, and code that is as small and bundled up as possible. Now for this, we need to go back to our application and we can take a look at the package.json file. Here we got a couple of scripts which are baked into this project setup. And thus far, we always used npm start. This also runs a script under the hood, but it runs a script which does transform our code so that it runs in the browser, but it does not optimize the code yet, and it does spin up a development server which hosts this development code. Now for production, we want to run the build command. This will also transform our code, but optimize and shrink it as much as possible, and it will not start a server. So hence here I'll quit this development process, and now we can run npm run build. That's how you run this build script, npm run build. Now this will build that production output as it says down there, and it can take a couple of seconds until it's done. So let's wait for that. Here we go. Now we're done. It also shows us how we could install a basic server to preview this production app on our local machine, because it doesn't start a server automatically anymore for this command. But at the moment, we can ignore this. If we scroll up a bit further, we also see what it did, and it shows us which files it generated. And we can find all those files in a newly added build folder. Now, this is a super important folder. The build folder, or to be precise, the content of this build folder, holds all the code you need to deploy in the end. This is the code, or these are the files which you need to move onto your server later so that your application runs there. Now, you should never change the code in this build folder, because the files in there will be overwritten automatically whenever you rerun npm run build. Instead, change your code in the source folder and maybe also in the public folder. Here you can add your own fav icon, for example, or change your robots.txt file for search engine crawlers. I will go with the defaults there, and hence now this is the build folder content that we will move onto a real server in the next lecture. Now before we go there, I want to highlight that it's the static folder in the build folder that contains your optimized CSS code and, most importantly, the optimized and browser-ready JavaScript code. Here we see all the JavaScript code we wrote, just translated and optimized. And of course, it's highly unreadable, but it is the code we wrote in the end, as we can tell by the CSS classes we see in there, for example. So now that's the content which we want to deploy. And that, of course, brings up one important question. How do we get this code onto a server, and which kind of server do we need? Now that we built the app for production, the next step is that we want to take that code in the build folder and move it onto a real server. We want to upload it to some hosting provider, to a real server, so that it is made available to visitors from all over the world. And now when it comes to uploading that code, there is one super important thing to realize. A React single-page application, or any single-page application actually, no matter which framework you used, is a static website. Which means that it's only made up of HTML, CSS, and browser-side JavaScript code. There is no server-side code involved. If we take a look at the output in the build folder, then we have a couple of images and config files here, and we have one HTML file, and in the static folder we have CSS and JavaScript. And the JavaScript code here is not server-side JavaScript code, it's not Node.js code, it is client-side, browser-side JavaScript code. And therefore this is code which executes in the browser. Hence, the entire build folder contains no code at all, that needed to be executed on a server. No Node.js code, no PHP code, nothing. You can, of course, also build your own backend, your own API, instead of Firebase, which we used as a dummy API in this course, but that's a totally different story. I do cover this in my MERN course, for example. But when it comes to just a React application, it is just such a static website, and there is no server-side code involved. And therefore, when we want to deploy such a React single-page application, we need a static site host. So we need a hosting provider and offering for hosting a static website. We don't need a hosting provider that allows us to run server-side code like Node.js or PHP or anything like that. We don't need that here. Now, how do you find such a host? Well, for example, you can simply Google for a static website hosting provider and you'll find different comparisons, certainly also some advertisements, and you'll find different results for hosting providers that help you with hosting your static site. For example, Google has a built-in service, AWS has a service that helps you with hosting static sites, the S3 service to be precise. If you click on here, you can learn more about that. But here, to give you an example, I will go with Firebase again. But it's just one possible option. And just because we're using Firebase as a dummy backend does not mean that you need to use Firebase for hosting. You're totally free there. You can use any hosting provider. You don't have to use Firebase, not in general, and also not specifically for this demo here. I simply picked it because it is fairly easy to use, and if we have a look at the pricing, we can get started for free here, which is also quite nice. Now, to host a site on Firebase, you need to create an account there, a Google account, and then log into Firebase. And here I'll use the project we worked on before in this course already. And here in that Firebase project, you can simply create a new one if you don't have one already. You can pick hosting. And if you then click on Get Started, you learn more about how that works. And it all starts by installing a certain tool on your system. So I will just copy that command here, go back to my command line here, and then run this command. On macOS and Linux, you might need to add sudo in front of it. On Windows, you don't, to give it the right permissions. So here I'll add that and enter my password. And now this installs this Firebase Tools software on my system. Now, because of -G, it installs it globally. So that is now not a project-specific tool, and it's also not a React-specific tool. It's just a general piece of software provided by Firebase for deploying any kind of static site to Firebase. So let's wait for this installation to finish now. And now that it is finished, if we go back to Firebase, we can click on Next here. And you see that as a next step, you need to log in. So you now need to run this command, which should now work now that Firebase Tools was installed, to log into your Firebase account. Now I am already logged in here. For you, it might prompt you for your credentials in the command line here, or it opens a browser tab where you need to log in. And once you did that, you should also be able to continue here in the command prompt. Now, once you are logged in, you need to run Firebase init. And now this needs to be executed in your project folder. So in this overall React project folder. Now, since I'm using this integrated terminal here, I am already navigated in there, and hence I can just run it here. Now, this command, when you execute it, will ask you a couple of questions. For example, it will ask us which Firebase features we want to use, because you can use this Firebase Tools software to administer other Firebase features as well. But here we just want to go to hosting and hit space, the space button on our keyboard, to select this option. And that is the only option we need to select here. So once you selected hosting, hit enter, And now you need to choose whether you want to create a new Firebase project or use an existing one. And I'll go with an existing one here and then select this project, which I also opened here in my browser console. So select that project and hit enter. And now it asks us a very important question here. It asks what we want to use as our public directory. And that simply means that it wants to know where the files are that it should deploy. Now, by default, it uses the public folder here, but that would be wrong here because public is a folder in our project, but it is a folder where we can change the images we use and so on. The actual output, which we want to deploy, lives in the build folder, as you learned. So here we don't want to use the default, but instead manually enter build here, since that's the folder name that contains our files that should be deployed. So that's super important. And if you use another hosting provider like AWS S3, you also want to upload the content of your build folder to that hosting provider. Now, as a next step, it conveniently asks us whether we want to configure this app as a single page app. So if we want to rewrite all URLs to index.html. But that can be a confusing question here. Why does this matter and what is it about? When deploying a single page application, it is important to understand that there is a difference between server-side routing and client-side routing. In this demo application which we built, which we're currently deploying here, we use routing. We use React Router to define routes and load different components based on the URL. But there is one super important thing to understand here. All that code executes in the browser. React Router is a browser-side package. It's even called React Router DOM. So it runs in the browser. It has a look at the URL and changes what we see on the screen after our React app was loaded by the browser. And why does this matter? Well, if I enter a URL and I hit enter and I then see the appropriate page on the screen, then that's the result of React Router having a look at the URL after the React app was loaded and then bringing the correct component onto the screen. But when I enter a URL and hit enter, this doesn't all happen in one step. Instead, we have a server and a client. Client is us, the user, using a browser. The server is a remote machine which hosts our production-ready React code, so the code we're currently deploying. That will live on some server, not on our local machine and not on the machines of our users. It's on some servers. Now, if a user then visits our page, enters the domain, and then maybe some path thereafter, this user sends a request to the server, a request for this website. Now, it's important to understand that this request contains the full URL that was entered, and that request then hits the server. Now, the server sends back a response which contains all the CSS and HTML code, but also our React code. This React code which we built and uploaded. Now, this React code contains the React Router code, which will have a look at the path, so the part of the URL after the domain, and it will then evaluate that and bring the correct component onto the screen. It will render the component which we defined for this path. But this only happens once the response was received. Now, actually, the URL which the user entered with the specific path entered by the user, like /some route, is also part of the request already though. So the request which reaches the server contains this path. It contains this full URL. And by default, a server would then look for different files, which it would return as a response for different URLs. That's how servers typically work. Different URLs trigger different actions and will lead to different responses. Now here, we actually don't want that. Here, when hosting a single page application, we want to ignore the path, so the part after the domain, on the server and always return the same response, the same HTML file and the same JavaScript files, no matter which path the user targeted. We need to do that so that our React application will start up, and then it's this React application and React router, which is part of that application, which will take another look at that URL and then render the correct content on the screen. So the server needs to ignore that path /some route. This needs to be ignored, and by default, a server does not do that. Hence, you need to configure your server so that it does do that. And you will need to look up the documentation of your specific hosting provider to find out how you configure it there. In the case of Firebase, it's very easy because they ask you whether you want to ignore that. This is exactly this point which we're seeing here. If all URLs should be rewritten to index.html, so that no matter which kind of URL the request was sent to, we always return the same HTML file, which then in turn requests always the same JavaScript code, no matter what the URL was. So therefore here, we want to enter Y for yes, and let Firebase set up this configuration. And that is this important configure the server step, which I mentioned earlier in this section. You need to configure your server such that the URL and the path in the URL is ignored on the server, and you always return your single page application code no matter what the URL was. So here we enter Y and hit enter. And now we don't need these automatic builds and deploys, so we can choose N for no here. And for this question whether the index.html file should be overwritten, we also want to choose no, because we want to go with that HTML file which was generated by the npm run build command. And now with that, Firebase deployment is configured. It wasn't deployed yet, but it's configured for deployment. Hence now we can click next here again, and now we just need to run this command to finally deploy our page. So here, if I now run Firebase deploy, that configuration will be used to now deploy our code in the build folder to Firebase. So now this uploads our code, and once it's done, it even gives us a pointer at the URL where we can view our application. And here it is. And that's now our React application hosted by a real server. So now that's not locally on our machine. Instead, that's coming from a real server out there in the web, and anyone could visit this page. Now in the hosting console here on Firebase, if you reload this hosting page now, you can configure this deployed application. You can add a custom domain if you want to. You can see a deployment history here. You can see certain usage stats, and so on. Now, if you ever want to take your page down, you can do this with the Firebase tool too. Here I'll do it, and I'll run Firebase hosting :disable. Now with that, I'll disable Firebase hosting for my page and confirm this. And now here on this hosting screen, if I reload this, I can select my old deployment down there and click delete to fully delete everything here. Now, of course, you don't want to do that as long as your users can reach the site, but since this was just a demo here, I also wanted to show you how you can then delete everything. And that is how you can prepare your React application for deployment and how you can then deploy it, in this case, to Firebase as an example.